Hey guys, Jake here. For this video, we're going to be taking another look into philosophical elements regarding Persona 5. Last time we discussed the philosophical elements and symbolism regarding the main cast within the game, along with some of the other side characters that you're able to form relationships with. We're going to be doing something similar here, but this time with the villains. After that, we'll also be exploring the game's main themes within its plots, and how that just kind of relates to the post-game as well. Couple disclaimers before we get started. For the purpose of this video, I'll be referencing events between Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royal. Persona 5 Royal is an enhanced version of the regular Persona 5 game with significant story changes, while the vast majority stays the same though. You shouldn't be too lost if you played one and not the other, as the main game is nearly identical between the two. That said, there will be some spoilers present in this video. Secondly, there's going to be a lot of overlap here between actual philosophical ideas and symbolism. Persona is a franchise heavily inspired by politics, religion, and mythology, and it should be no secret as to how philosophy plays its roles within these studies, but also how images and icons are created throughout culture to further amplify the philosophy of politics, religion, and mythology. Does that make sense? Great. So this video is kind of going to be split up into two loose parts. The first part is going to be focused on the multiple antagonists within the game and the significance of each one. To discuss these villains, we'll be categorizing them into subsections. First is villains as the character, in and of themselves, who they are and what are their goals. Second is going to be more in line with that character's symbolic elements. What about them is the player made aware of, despite it not necessarily being directly told or spoken to them. Lastly, what the significance of the character is in comparison to the greater narrative. To conclude this video then, in the second half, we'll be taking a deeper look into the actual plot and events of the game and deciphering the overall message and narrative. We'll be doing this for the post-game as well. Alright, so without further ado, let's begin with the villains. The main thing to note with the villains is that there is a significant number of them. In fact, in the original Persona 5, you can identify anywhere from 7 to 9 main villains within the game. The reason that number varies is due to several technicalities, as we'll get into momentarily. Despite that variable, all of the villains follow a theme, this being the 7 deadly sins. Similarly to how the characters you meet and interact with represent one of the 22 main Arcana cards in tarot games, the villains follow suit, pun intended, by all representing one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, if you know anything about the history of the 7 sins, then you'd probably not be too shocked to know that the 7 themselves have changed over time. As such, some sins have been categorized or renamed over the years, which is primarily why you can potentially identify more than 7 villains in the game. Alongside this theme, most of these characters also have alternate forms that are named after the 7 princes of hell. This is due to the fact that the princes themselves are typically paired with one of the sins naturally. I felt the need to inform you of this now, rather than throw in a weird curveball halfway through each and every analysis, so yeah. Anyways, let's begin. Starting with Kamoshida, it should come to no surprise that he represents lust. Kamoshida is the first boss that you fight in this game. He acts as the volleyball coach and track coach for the school, physically abusing the men's teams and sexually and verbally insulting the women's teams. Kamoshida is your capital L definition of a low loser. Not only is he lustful towards the young women that he coaches, but he also sees himself as king of the school. He is the reason that the school is well known for its sports programs, despite it being at the cost of the students' well-being. As the player enters his cognition, you can see his kingly mindset actualized in fruition. He sees himself as king with the school as his castle, the boys' teams as his slaves and prisoners, and the women as his personal playthings. You can also see the fact that he has an incredibly high sex drive given his attire within his cognition, wearing only a pink Speedo underneath his royal robe and crown. As simple as it is, Kamoshida exemplifies the dangers of the sin of lust. Kamoshida's relationship to the greater narrative doesn't really connect with him specifically, but mostly just the themes within his palace. As previously mentioned, Kamoshida's role as a villain is to represent the sin of lust. Obviously, Kamoshida's story does that well. Kamoshida's alternate form's name is Suguru Asmodeus Kamoshida, named after Asmodeus, the demon prince of lust. Naturally, the in-game name for his palace is the Castle of Lust. We'll see the other characters do a similar thing as well. Up next is Madarame. Truth be told, I was kind of having a little trouble identifying what Madarame's sin was, as I was comparing his actions to that of Envy, given his story. But after just reading the calling card that the player group sends him, I was easily reminded that he represented vanity. It actually pays to read dialogue, doesn't it now? Anyways, Madarame is the second boss that you fight in this game. He is the artistic mentor of a student you meet named Yusuke. It turns out, Yusuke is not the first pupil that Madarame had under his wing. In fact, it is revealed that Madarame has had multiple pupils, of which he stole their art and resold it as his own. This, obviously, happens to Yusuke. The worst of it all, though, is that Madarame not only stole Yusuke's paintings, but his mother's as well, particularly her painting of herself with her son, and then it resold it to become his most popular piece. Madarame's palace takes the form of an art museum filled with the art of the students that he's stolen from. Within his palace, Madarame can be found wearing bright, powdery makeup and very rich and traditional Eastern robes. With his palace and attire in mind, you can easily tell how Madarame is to represent vanity. He's just completely full of himself, despite not showing anything of his own. Unlike Kamoshida, we can actually string Madarame's connection to the overall plot a little bit nicer. Before we do that though, let's discuss the symbolic connections with Madarame. Madarame's alternate form's name is, I don't know how to say that, just whatever his first name is, Azazel Madarame, named after Azazel. From what I can find, there isn't a whole lot of connection between Azazel and the sin of vanity itself. The several interpretations we have of Azazel portray him as the individual who taught man to make weapons and armor. Azazel is also portrayed to be the serpent from the garden, but so are most of these demon princes as well. In fact, several of these demons seem to participate in the role of the traditional Protestant view of Satan. I say this to mean that in most of these deuterocanonical texts that we're searching through, Satan, Lucifer, and some of the other names that he goes by are all in fact different demons, although sometimes they're also referred to be one or the other. So don't be too shocked when I mention a figure that you may in fact think is synonymous with another or different. It's a little confusing. Anyways, not quite sure why Azazel is pinned here with Madarame, but it is. Another tie we have from Madarame to vanity is the fact that his palace is called the Museum of Vanity. Anyways, Madarame is the first character that you meet who mentions a black masked figure. As you play the game, you come to find out that the black masked figure is another individual using the metaverse to meddle with people's hearts. However, instead of changing their hearts for the better, this person is killing their victims within their own cognition, causing them to have a mental breakdown. It's later revealed that this black masked figure is working for another antagonist that we'll discuss near the end of the video, but it's implied that Madarame was involved with this individual on some degree. Next we have Kaneshiro. In my opinion, Kaneshiro is the most forgettable boss out of the bunch, simply because he is smack dab in the middle of the first post-tutorial dungeon and then Futaba's palace, which is incredibly story-driven. Despite this, we'll still look at him. Kaneshiro is supposedly a top dog within the Japanese mafia or underground crime syndicate. One of your classmates and soon-to-be team members ends up getting a voice recording between you and your party members discussing the metaverse, and she attempts to blackmail you all with the evidence. She has agreed to not release the audio clip if you are able to get involved with some other students who have been taking off jobs for Kaneshiro. As such, the party naturally gets involved with Kaneshiro's group. Ironically enough, Kaneshiro then blackmails all of you, including the girl, for getting involved with him unless you work for him. He's blackmailing you with more blackmail, if that kind of makes sense. This is when you attempt to change his cognition. His dungeon is a bank, and his attire within his cognition has him wearing a bright white business suit while having the face and form of a fly. The fact his dungeon takes the shape of a bank shows into his gluttony, as he manipulates people's lives for his own benefit. The NPCs that you find around and inside Kaneshiro's palace take the form of ATMs, and are constantly seen spewing out money for Kaneshiro's bank to collect. Kaneshiro's design itself takes inspiration from a fly, which are insects commonly associated with tampering of food. However, you may recognize a connection of demons and flies being associated to the demon Beelzebub. We'll get into that in a moment. You might take Kaneshiro better as the sin of greed, which I do think would work, but we have another character who's honestly better fit for that. Likewise with the other villains that we've discussed, the calling card for Kaneshiro calls him out for the sin of gluttony. Furthermore, his palace is called the Bank of Gluttony. As previously mentioned, Kaneshiro's appearance takes the form of a fly. When in this form, Kaneshiro is known as Junya Baal Kaneshiro, named after the demon prince of wrath, Baal. As previously mentioned, Kaneshiro's appearance as a fly might make you think of the demon Beelzebub. Why wouldn't Kaneshiro be named after that demon instead? From what I can find anyways, it appears that Beelzebub is one of the more significant demon princes of gluttony. Well, I believe the answer merely lies in the disclaimer that I had mentioned before with Madarame. It appears that this demon's name changes depending on the story being told, and what role they may play in it. While I think Beelzebub may make more sense, Beelzebub is also an alias for Lucifer or Satan. Truth be told, I think the developers went with the name Baal in order to not confuse the player with other demons or personas that take more direct inspiration from Lucifer and or Satan. Thus, if Baal can be seen as an alias of Beelzebub, and Beelzebub is the desired prince of hell that the developers wanted to use to represent gluttony, then I can see why they went with it. Kaneshiro's involvement to the overall plot can easily be seen within his role in the crime world. Given Persona 5's emphasis on politics and societal structure, it's no surprise that other characters or villains you face have affiliated themselves with Kaneshiro in some form or fashion, even including some of your classmates. Alright, so if you're like me, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait, what? Futaba can't represent a sin, she's on your team. And if you did say that, I would agree with you. You're totally right, but at the end of the day, you do enter her palace, so she's gotta fit somewhere thematically. You can also consider the calling card that the Phantom Thief sent to her as further proof, in which they call Futaba out for, quote, committing the great sin of drowning in sloth. As a reminder, you'll find throughout this video that there are several characters that seemingly have similar sins. This is because the 7 deadly sins have actually changed according to the Catholic tradition over the years. This isn't to say that the sins themselves have changed, but rather how we perceive and categorize them. Futaba's sin of sloth actually resembles more of the older term acedia, that refers more to a lack of joy or love. This expression of sloth is more commonly known as apathy, the attribute of having a lack of interest, enthusiasm, or concern. These traits suit Futaba best during her time as a recluse before she joins your team. You can also see Futaba's expression of apathy throughout her palace. Futaba's palace takes the form of a pyramid, which is commonly used as the burial place of prominent Egyptian figures such as pharaohs. While Futaba's self-perception of a pharaoh seems a little misplaced, the emphasis should be on the environment itself. A pyramid is a place quite literally lacking in life. There is not any emotion to be found there, especially that of joy or love. The character traits and types of enemies that you fight also reflect Futaba's personality too, as there's plenty of magician, hermit, and priest-related enemies that are normally more timid, gloomy, or irritable. Enough about Futaba though, let's talk about her dead mother, Wakaba. The Wakaba you meet in Futaba's palace takes the form of a sphinx that guards the pyramid. Futaba's cognition of her sphinx mother resembles the sin of wrath, as Futaba perceives her mother as a wrathful woman who is angry at her daughter for her own death, a faulty perception of reality, but one that was beaten into Futaba by the people around her. This perception of self-imposed wrath can also be seen with the name of Futaba's palace, called the Pyramid of Wrath. So despite the fact that neither of these individuals are associated with one of the princes of hell, both of these sins are covered here between these two characters. Next we have Okumura. Okumura is the parent of another one of your teammates, Haru. Okumura is the CEO of Okumura Foods, the company behind the Big Bang Burger franchise. Okumura's palace is a spaceport with intersecting ships and fleets that you travel to and fro. This is to resemble Okumura's desire of wealth, as only someone this wealthy could afford such a galactic property. This is further seen with how some of the robot NPCs in the spaceport break down from the hard labor, and are disposed of almost immediately. Following suit, the spaceport is called the Spaceport of Greed, so there isn't much hiding that either. Arguably, you could make the case for Okumura and Kaneshiro's traits to be switched, as greed and gluttony seem similar enough. The actual difference between the sins is that gluttony refers to material that can be consumed, such as food and drink, whereas greed refers to external possessions such as money. Neither Kaneshiro or Akamura are really seen out robbing your local Applebee's, but I think the case can be made for either one, especially since Okumura is the one running a food franchise after all. Aside from Okumura's palace implying extreme wealth, there isn't much to tether his actual character design to his assigned Prince of Hell, being Mammon. Supposedly, Mammon's name literally just means money, thus associated with greed and thereby Okumura. Okumura's relation to the plot ties further with the previously mentioned Black Masked figure. Okumura is the first of this group of villains that dies at the hands of the Black Masked figure. All the other villains thus far have all had a change of heart due to your team's efforts. If I recall, the reason the Black Masked figure kills Okumura is because he's too high up and knows too much about Shido, the up-and-running politician running for Prime Minister, who we'll talk about here shortly. Okay, so the next character to discuss is Sai Nijima, who is the older sister to your very own Makoto Nijima that's on your team. Sai is a prosecutor and is known for her crude and forceful methods to get the information she needs in court. She has a very strong sense of justice, so much so that has inspired the likes of her younger sister Makoto, but she also works very closely with Akechi, a local detective high school prodigy, as well. However, in her own workplace, she feels very undermined and not in control. Due to her status as a woman, she feels as if she has to be crude and forceful in order to compete with her coworkers and opponents in court. Sai's palace is a casino, which ironically enough also seems to have greedy or gluttonous traits. The important fixation shouldn't be on the palace itself, but more of the reason behind it. Sai runs the casino and has control of everything. This is most likely due to her insecurities within her workplace. These insecurities and lack of control are shown due to the fact that most of the games at the casino are rigged, and even the boss fight against Sai has her altering the results of the casino games. There isn't a whole lot else to pick from her, as her palace itself sums up her desire and sin rather well. As expected, her palace itself is called the Casino of Envy. During her boss fight, her alternate form is called Sai Leviathan Nijima, named after Leviathan, the demon prince associated with envy. There isn't much I could find from actual texts to suggest Leviathan's association with envy. Rather, according to the studies of Thomas Aquinas and Peter Binsfeld, Leviathan is said to swallow the envious souls of those who die. I do believe that you can easily connect Sai's story to envy, given how she feels she needs to be in control of the workplace. She is envious of her workmates and opponents in court that seemingly have control simply due to their differing gender roles. As such, her crude and forceful methods can be compared to that of the Leviathan, swallowing people whole without mercy. It's a bit of a loose stretch, but that's the best I got for her. Lastly, we have pride, said to be the deadliest of all sins. The palace's owner is Masayoshi Shido, a politician who is running for prime minister. You run into Shido before the events of the game. As he's forcing himself onto a woman, your player character attempts to step in to save her. Shido accidentally hurts himself, blames you, and buys the woman out so she wouldn't say anything. As a result, you're forced to move out of your house, change schools, and live with the local coffee shop owner who acts as your probation supervisor. All that to say, you've got some beef with this dude. Shido's palace takes the form of a cruise ship that is sailing through a flooded Japan. The symbolism here is to suggest that he cares very little for Japan as a whole, and would rather trail through it with his own high and mighty accord. The occupants of the ship are people that Shido has in his pocket in the real world, being anything from celebrities to other politicians to news reporters. One thing to note about Shido's palace and the metaverse is that you and your group's Phantom Thief attire only spawn when the Cognition host sees you as a threat. This happens in Futaba's palace up until the very end, and in Nijima's palace when you're caught sneaking around her casino. In Shido's palace, you don't change into your thieving attire until after you enter the bulk of the ship, but this isn't to suggest that Shido sees you as a threat. Rather, if you notice, almost everyone on the ship wears masks too, all hiding their true self and nature from one another, as if they're all almost corrupt as the other. Another thing to note about Shido's palace is the excessive use of lion imagery throughout the ship. There can be several reasons for this. Primarily, the name Shido can roughly mean little lion. Lions are also often associated with royalty and power, primarily due to their place on the animal kingdom's food chain. Lastly, another association between lions and Shido is the fact that the group of lions are also called a pride. which, of course, is Shido's associated deadly sin. Perhaps the most significant thing to notice about Shido takes place during his boss fight. Shido has numerous forms you have to battle through in order to defeat him. These forms can collectively all be called the Chariot of Human Sacrifices, to which there are 3 sub-forms. The first form is simply in the shape of a lion and is called Beast of Human Sacrifice. While the name seems edgy enough, it could also be a reference to one of the beasts emerging from the Book of Revelation. The Beast of Human Sacrifice may be a reference to the first beast that comes out of the sea and is given authority and power. The second beast is said to come out of the earth and is associated as a false prophet or the Antichrist. The position of the Beast of Human Sacrifice and Shido himself could be a parallel to these 2 biblical beasts. The second form of Shido's within this fight is his Wings of Human Sacrifice forms, which seems to just be the same lion-looking figure, but with wings now. The last chariot form Shido has is the Tomb of Human Sacrifice, which takes the form of a pyramid. As we discussed earlier, pyramids obviously have associations with the dead, given the fact that it's, well, a tomb, obviously. But you're probably wondering why all of these forms refer to human sacrifice. According to some trivia from Persona 5 Royal, these forms that Shido makes are made up of the bodies of people that Shido has disposed of in order to get as high as he is in politics. Lastly, another key thing to point out about Shido's design is that when you defeat his human sacrifice forms, he'll become extremely buff, kinda like Bane from Batman. This is the form in which Shido takes on his associated Prince of Hell name, except it isn't a Prince of Hell at all. The name Shido takes is Samael. As expected, this is a heavy reference to different historical texts within Christianity and Judaism. To start, the name Samael means poison of God or also blind God, and is interpreted as either the right hand of God or an enemy of God, depending on the story. Some scholars also theorize that Samael was either the serpent that deceived Eve or is the true father of Cain. Lastly, and most important to the central themes of Persona 5, Samael is an alternate name for the Demiurge, who in Gnostic traditions is the creator of evil material in the universe, while non-material and spiritual stuff is all good. The Demiurge and its lore within Gnosticism is going to be something that we dive into pretty extensively here in a minute. Concerning Shido's sin, most would presumably associate pride with Lucifer himself, as Lucifer is the most central figure in all of demonology, and pride is said to be the deadliest and/or origin sins of all sins. As mentioned earlier though, Lucifer and his more common aliases are reserved for another character. Shido is the last of the human characters with a sinful palace that we'll discuss. Next on the docket is Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth is a prominent figure in Gnostic tradition, as it is the creator and/or former of the material world. Another name or alias for Yaldabaoth is the Demiurge. For the sake of simplification, I'd like you to think of the Demiurge as the evil creator being, and Yaldabaoth simply as an alias or different personality that the Demiurge takes on. From here on out, the story of Persona 5 follows the lore of Gnostic mythology. The word Gnosticism comes from the word gnosis, which is the Greek term for knowledge. It's also where you get the term agnostic from, for example. Before I get too deep in Gnosticism though, I'd like to describe Yaldabaoth in Persona 5. Yaldabaoth actually takes on the form of the Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus supposedly drank from during the Last Supper. The Holy Grail is rumored to give whoever drinks it immortality, but it is commonly used in pulp culture to be a once-in-a-lifetime wishing well. In Persona 5, society has become so aimless that the mass populace of the world has unknowingly been feeding their wishes and desires to the Demiurge, to the Holy Grail. Eventually, the Holy Grail became overloaded with humanity's wishes, and it grew to become Yaldabaoth, the god of control. As the name implies, Yaldabaoth was born with the intention of granting humanity's subconscious wishes by ordaining humanity for the rest of time, removing their free will in exchange for a purpose in life. That's the basic summary of Yaldabaoth in Persona 5. As far as Gnosticism goes, Gnostics believe that the Demiurge entraps humanity in physical forms. Because of this, we have become limited beings. We are limited in what we can do and what we can know. As the story goes within Gnosticism, the demiurge can essentially be seen as the Old Testament God, a being and deity that made man physical and prohibited man from learning specific knowledge in the garden. According to the Gnostics, it is their interpretation of the serpent who bestows divine knowledge onto Adam and Eve in an attempt to free them from the demiurge. It is important to note too that Gnostics view the demiurge separate from the descriptions of God and Jesus in the New Testament. They are two separate beings. The unknown God and Jesus from the New Testament are instead working either as, with, or for the original spiritual creating Sophia, whose name just means wisdom. You guys are starting to see a whole motif of wisdom versus knowledge here, aren't you? Anyways, with that loose background out of the way, we can now see what the final boss of Persona 5 is meant to be. Yes, you fight Yaldabaoth, aka the Demiurge, aka Gnostic Old Testament God. In this scenario, you take on the role of the Serpent, who is attempting to free humanity from the control of Yaldabaoth. You are Sataniel. In this scenario, you are attempting to stop Yaldabaoth from removing free will from humanity, which is slightly different than the Gnostic idea of Yaldabaoth basically just keeping divine secrets and knowledge, but I digress. The theme of fighting for free will has kind of been an underlining theme throughout the entire game, mostly through the characters involved with the palaces you venture through. In a way, Persona 5 is about self-expression, and not changing who you are on account of what society, or, the god of control, demands you to be. Shido would physically, verbally, and sexually abuse his students, forcing them to all obey him if they wanted to do good in sports or grades. Madarame would steal his students' paintings, disabling any of his students to actually grow as artists or expressing their art. Kaneshiro would manipulate and blackmail people to do his bidding, and took advantage of them for his own gluttonous gain. Futaba's false perception of her mother prevented her from going out and living a life, forcing her into a recluse. Okumura would treat his daughter as nothing more than a business deal, along with his employees, all for the betterment of his monetary empire. Sai is more seen as a victim of being pushed into acting a certain way, as her forceful nature was the only way she knew how to survive in being strong within her workplace. Lastly, Shido was the one who rigged the events of the game from the start, forcing you to change schools and move away from home after he falsely accused you of assaulting him. Not only that, but his iron fist over the political climate of Japan was nothing short of tyranny. At the very end of it, you defy Yaldabaoth, and you defy society's expectations of who you are and who you want to be. At the end of it all, you, the player, are the ultimate rebel. Perhaps two of the most controversial debates within theology are that of free will versus predeterminism, and that within the problem of evil. The common problem is that if God is all-powerful and all-good, how could there be evil in the world? After all, if God is all-good, it would seem to suggest that God would want to remove all sinfulness and evil. Perhaps, though, God is not powerful enough, as he seemingly would have done so, but he hasn't. Many theologians may credit humanity's free will as a solution to this problem, as God gifts humanity with the freedom of choice. Our sin is just merely a result of that. However, not all theologians agree that God has given us free will. Rather, some may believe that time itself from beginning to end is all determined strictly by God. After all, if God does not ordain every single tiny thing, then wouldn't that mean that those things are not under his control? Is God truthfully not always sovereign? That doesn't sound right if we're discussing an all-powerful deity here. Persona 5 takes these two theological debates and merges them with the Gnostic story of the Demiurge. Rather than the Demiurge keeping divine knowledge hidden from us, the Demiurge is harboring our freedom to choose. This brings us to our last villain to discuss, Maruki. Maruki is a counselor that your school hires after the events of Kamoshida. He's very kind and compassionate, and he attempts to take good care and provide counsel to you and your party members. Over time, you end up assisting Maruki with his older research in cognitive science. At one point or another, all of your teammates confide in Maruki in some form. By the end of the original main story, when Yaldabaoth is defeated, a power vacuum appears for who society is supposed to believe in, now that the Demiurge is no longer controlling everything. Naturally, this would seem to fall into the player's shoulders for defeating the Demiurge, but due to the fact that you and your teammates have been confiding and believing in Maruki, it's actually Maruki who accidentally ended up with the power to influence society. Now, this isn't to make Maruki sound malicious, though. With this power, Maruki makes a world in which everyone's wishes come true. Your friend Akechi, who dies during the events of the original game, is alive. Futaba's mother is alive. Haru has a good relationship with her father, and so much more. Maruki isn't using these good deeds as a disguise for malicious intent either. There isn't anything else going on behind the scenes. This utopia is simply what Maruki wants to accomplish. However, in fulfilling everyone's wishes, Maruki must maintain complete control. The cost of this control is the free will of those that he's helping. The player now finds them in a similar conundrum to before, one akin to the discourse regarding Eldebaoth. This discourse, however, does not find itself rooted in Gnosticism as much as it does in modern Christian debates. The idea with Maruki is that he is genuinely, completely benevolent. This is the type of conflict that Christian theologians might perceive with the Judeo-Christian God in regards to free will. Traditionally, these two camps, for free will and determinism, whether it be for good or bad, are called Arminianism and Calvinism, respectively. These terms do imply other kind of aspects and beliefs within theology as a whole, but their views on free will and predeterminism are arguably what they're best known for. The Calvinistic perspective, named after reformer John Calvin, holds a rather strict view of God's managing role of time. Any and everything that ever has happened, is happening, and will ever happen has all been determined by God himself. Say, even God's own actions when interacting with a created finite space and time would prove to be predetermined as well, as God is generally understood to exist outside of space-time. While this position does well to uphold God's sovereignty of all of creation, it's also typically criticized under the notion that God would therefore also be the author of all things that he seemingly doesn't approve of. As John Piper has said, God is the author of sin. If God ultimately dictates every single thing to ever happen, then our sins and transgressions would be a result of God's dictation to make us sin. This not only seems contradictory on a logistic level for a deity to do, but also seemingly goes against the caring and loving nature that Christians advertise of their God. Contrary to Calvinism is Arminianism, named after Jacobus Arminius. The Arminian view is primarily concerned with upholding God's sovereignty through his omniscience of creation, rather than more direct control. Arminianism holds that God is all-knowing about all possible futures, and also which possible future is the, quote, definitive future. At the same time, though, Arminianism does not hold that God is dictating these possible futures. Rather, they are the result of human free will and choice, and God just happens to know which possible future will end up happening. The similarities between these camps and the conflict of Persona 5 Royal's postgame may seem a tad stretched with this background information, but I find them to be furthering an interesting dialogue with pop culture and theology. In Persona 5 Royal's postgame, Maruki represents hardcore Calvinism. He has assumed the role of a benevolent god, dictating decisions and the livelihood of everyone around him. While he has seemingly robbed people of their free will, he has given them a life with nothing but assured happiness and goodness. The Phantom Thieves, then, would represent the Arminian side, where the characters are free to make their own decisions and live their own lives, with the assured outcome, though, of potential failure, heartbreak, and evil. The Phantom Thieves' perspective in conjunction with Arminianism could be summarized to ask Maruki's Calvinism the following question. What good is a good life if we can't make it good on our own? Isn't it intrinsically worth more value to achieve goodness with the potential of failure, to overcome failure, or to fail nonetheless but then rise again to succeed? In the end, Persona 5 does essentially seem to favor the Phantom Thieves' Arminianism over Maruki's Calvinism. After all, a game in which, the central theme is free will and breaking free from constraints of society and all, it will normally tend to, promote the idea of free will and so on. That's why discussions like this can kind of only been taken with a grain of salt in the world of theology and philosophy, because the protagonist in these stories normally is predestined to win and to be proven right by the end anyways. The debate between Arminianism and Calvinism in real life is not this black and white and cut and dry, and can't be solved by a mere turn-based battle between giant psychological kaijus. If you wish to learn more about Arminianism and Calvinism, though, I would highly recommend Millard Erickson's book, Introducing Christian Doctrine. If you wish to learn more about Gnosticism, then there's a couple books on Christian heresies that I'll link in the description below. All in all, guys, thanks so much for being patient on this video with me. I've been working on this video rather quietly over the last 2 years, and finally have been able to work on it more after graduating college. As I finish this video and post it, I'll actually be starting a master's program to further my education here shortly. In many ways, this video, and the first one, go to show my willingness and desire to bridge the gap between contemporary art and pulp culture to philosophical and theological concepts. I'm glad I got to take this journey with you all. Please share this video with your liking friends, drop a like, and subscribe if you like the content. It'll mean a lot to me with the work that I've done here and the work that I've done before. Anyways, guys, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. This is Jake, logging off. Peace.